It's my pleasure to introduce to you Kathy HIRSH-PASEK, who is the director of the Child and Infant Laboratory at Temple University and a member of the Psychology Department, distinguished and faculty fellow also at Temple. Kathy will be followed by KATHRYN Snow, who is a faculty member here at the Graduate School of Education and who's, among her many contributions, whose research told us it's not about the print, but it's about the language around the print. Followed by that, we've got Jason SACHS, the Director of Early Childhood for the Boston Public Schools, and one we are proud to call an alum of our program, and has worked tirelessly for the last decade on the pre-K project in Boston that we've heard referenced a few times already today. Kathy, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Lonnie. Is this mic working? We cool? Yeah? No? Hello? Is there any tech person? Working better now? Yeah. All right. I usually have a voice, so it's good to have a voice. Anyway, I just want to say how cool it is to be here. I want to thank President Obama for launching this conference, and I want to thank Lonnie and Stephanie. How did you guys know? I mean, that's just amazing. That is clairvoyance if I ever saw it. I want to thank Deborah, because boy, did you set the scene. It's really great. And even though I come to you as a language person and a cognitive person, and I am indeed going to talk about language and some stuff having to do with STEM, I have to sneak that in. And I'm also sneaking in for Lonnie a whole piece about play, because that's a whole other area that I do work on as an environment that's, I think, really important for learning. So the last person I really want to thank is you, Commissioner, for so getting it. And that is just wonderful. You've been a model. You've been a model for the whole country. So I titled the talk today, How High-Quality Language Environments Create High-Quality Learning Environments. And I think what you're going to see is a little bit of a contrast from what you saw with Deb, which is that I decided to do a drive-by. So think of this as speed dating. But it was the only way I could get everything out in 35 minutes, and they even said I could have 40. So I won't talk too fast, I promise. But I do want to share a lot of ideas with you that I think build on ideas that we heard in Deb's presentation and that we also heard in the commentary. So wonderful stuff. All right, so everybody's talking about these three initiatives, one being the 30 million word gap, where there was another White House conference in October. And we're talking about grade level reading campaign. Okay, so that's on everybody's tongue, and universal preschool. And I know today is about the latter, but I'd like to suggest that they're really quite interconnected, that we talk of them as three different strands, but wow, when we solve one of them, we're probably doing a lot to solve the others. So what unites each of these initiatives? All right, you already know the answer to this because I'm a language lady. The answer in this presentation is going to be that a lot of it is really around early language skills. And I'm also going to suggest to you that the quality of that language environment matters, and we're going to go right back to what Marty just said to you and what Deb just said to you. It's all about the relationship, because having a conversation matters. And one of my takeaways today is going to be about what I'm going to call a conversational duet, because a lot of times in our classrooms, we think that we can sing solo. And we talk a lot at people, but we're not talking enough with people. So I want you to try to get that image today of what a conversational duet might look like. And I'm going to push the bounds of what I always loved. I loved when Jack Shonkoff introduced us to serve and return. But I'm going to suggest to you that it may not just be serve and return. Think of it more as serve and return and return and return and return. Hence the conversational duet. All right, so let me show you why I think these are all related and then give you what I think might be a one-page solution or something to think about that I can put on one page. The 30 million word gap, I know you all know about it. So number 34. Okay, you know about the difference in the welfare, working class, professional families that were studied. I do want to let you know that there's been a lot of research since then by folks like Erica Hoff and by Meredith Rowe. I mean, this is very real. Even if you would think that the Hart and Risley may not have been the best data that you ever saw in the world, there really is a lot of stuff that I think converges on this point. And those results were staggering. Okay, which is, I think, why they caught everyone. And caught us, I think, by surprise. To find out that in this professional families, kids were hearing more than 3 times as many words per hour if you calculated it out. Oh, that's just shocking. And you asked, what is the consequence of that? And we noticed that there really is a consequence in the number of words that the child's then going to have in this professional family versus the working class family versus the welfare at age 3. But perhaps even more dramatic, and thank you for mentioning that we have to go to the first 3 years. That was so important as a commentary. I can't find you, but thank you wherever you're sitting. Is that what happens at age 3 actually projects out to language at age 9 and 10, to reading scores, and even to things like the number of root words that you have in 2nd grade, like knowing that teach is somewhere hanging out in teacher, all right, which is really important, or that heal is somewhere hanging out in the word health. Now, Hart and Risley actually made another point. This is the point that's ignored, so I thought I'd bring it back today. We talk a lot about the quantity of language when we talk about Hart and Risley, but they also talked about the dance. And they even called it the dance. I'm going with conversational duet, but it's all the same thing, really, which is that you need to have a conversation, a back and forth. And that dance, that quality of language, and there's going to be many, many ways in which we'll use the term quality of language, and all of them matter. And KATHRYN Snow, who I've been learning from for so long, so I'm so thrilled that she's one of the discussants, will tell you even more about what that content needs to look like. But that dance is really important. It's not all just about the quantity. All right, let's go to the campaign for grade level reading. I mean, you've heard this before. More than 80% of 3rd graders from low-income families will not be reading at 3rd grade in 3rd grade, and that's a problem. At least half of the school achievement gap between rich and poor kids is starting well before kindergarten. And I think that's one of the messages that was so well reinforced earlier this week in Washington. And that 42 states across the United States have joined with the Casey Foundation and the grade level reading campaign. How exciting is that, right? That people are joining forces. But if we're really going to do something about it, and the National Governors Association called together a group of us 2 years ago and issued a white report or a white paper on this, you got to deal not just with reading, you have to deal with language as well. Let me show you why. Let's just take 1 second of reading. First, you have to process the print. You have to see that B, that O, and that Y. Why? And then you have to translate it into sounds. All right, Lonnie's done awesome work in language and reading. But let's face it, when you do that, you get B, Y. So then what you do as a teacher sometimes is you solve the problem. You tell them, well, okay, just say it really fast. So say it with me. Boya. Well, I already have illustrated the problem. Boya isn't going to get you to boy, all right? You have to know something about how those sounds go together for real words that are in a real head that can be accessed with real meaningfulness. Or reading doesn't matter. I've always loved the way Hollis Scarborough talks about it. She talks about strands that are woven into skilled reading. And those strands include word recognition, which is what we spend a heck of a lot of time on. And by the way, I think it's really important. But that's only going to get you so far. I spent many years in Hebrew school. And I have no idea what this means. Okay. All right, so language comprehension is really key. You have to have background knowledge. You have to understand language structures. You have to understand vocabulary. And in tons of research, I put too much on this slide just to show you there's tons of research. Okay, so the tons of research is there to show you that there are direct links between oral language and reading outcomes later in 3rd and 4th grade on thousands of kids. They're indirect, because you have to have the language to be able to break it up so you can find the b, and y in the first place, okay? And it turns out that language actually becomes even more important over time, not less important, as you read to learn rather than learning to read. And although having two languages is a great thing, I want to repeat that because I really, really mean it. Having 2 languages is a great and important thing. And we all just came out, a group of us just came out with a social policy report from Marty's group, which is the Society for Research in Child Development. Well, come on, got to get some credit here. 2/3 of the world is multilingual. I mean, this is normal, unless you're in the United States, where it's not. But these kids have, in many ways, a special disadvantage because they're hit with dual risk, okay? Many of our kids in this country, not in other countries, where bilingualism doesn't mean that you're poor, all right? But you have poverty and you're hearing multiple languages, and for these kids, it's really a tough go, and many of them have trouble catching up because they don't have the language skills in either language to help them succeed. So thus, as in the 30 million word gap, strong language skills build strong reading, and our science has taught us how to build these strong language skills. Finally, today's topic, universal preschool or preschool for all. As you know, there's a huge push nationally. I think this got major oomph at the White House this week, which is so exciting, but we have to guarantee that it's going to be of high quality. And I think if we can guarantee that there is high quality talk, and for those of you taking pictures of the slides, I will also make all of my slides available to everyone, because there's a lot of them, and I know I'm doing speed dating, and I'm sorry, but I want to give you all this. But anyway, it's really important, and you're going to see that it's important not only for literacy, but I'll make the point that it's also important for STEM. Now there's a shocker. Okay, so here we go. What I want to do today is to call from a lot of different scientific literature. As Lonnie said, call from a lot of different scientific literature, so I am. From the science of learning, from education, from linguistics, and psychology, to offer, this is very bold here, 6 evidence-based principles of language learning that we could encourage in school and at home. And then I want to talk to you about some of the implications and outreach of using those. Let me first go to the 6 evidence-based principles. All right, I got a call from the state of California. They were revamping their language and literacy curriculum. And when they called, I was really worried because I thought, I don't do curriculum. Know nothing about it. I do this little lab stuff. But they said, but that's who we want. We want to know if you can really pull together a curriculum that would embrace the various principles. And by the way, as you think about California, it's so interesting because it's already a majority-minority state. So you don't want to give examples that will work for one group but won't work for others. And so what my collaborator, Roberta Golenkoff, and I did is we asked whether we could take what we know in the language literature. This is going to be one of my takeaways because I think we should do this for all the literatures. Could we take what we do know, not what we fight about, but what we know, because there's lots we fight about, and could we put it down so that it would be what I'm calling edible science, okay? Accessible, digestible, and usable. Edible science, all right? And we came up with these 6 principles. So principle 1 is children learn what they hear most. Principle 2 is that children learn words for events and things that interest them. This is the grandmother principle. You're supposed to go, duh, okay? All right, 3, but critically important, and I think Deb laid the foundation for this, is that interactive and responsive environments is what builds language. You're not going to get it if you don't have the relationship. It just won't happen. You can't learn language from putting on a television. And we'll come back to that. 4, they learn in meaningful context, hence play. So I'm going to come back to that. 5, they need to learn diverse examples of words and language structures. And KATHRYN will talk a lot more about that. And we somehow, somewhere got the idea that vocabulary and grammar were two different things. Totally divorced, and you should spend your whole time in preschool teaching vocabulary. And vocabulary is great, honestly it is. I love vocab. But it's intrinsically linked with grammar and syntax. So they go together. All right, what I want to do now is just give you a little bit of evidence. This is the super speed dating part, so that you can see why I use these 6 principles. You know the Hart and Risley. You know that amount did make a difference in what the kids hear and in what the kids then use. Number 2 is that the amount is important for statistical learning. I kid you not. In a classic study from 1996, Safran, Aslan, and Newport showed us that little guys, 8-month-olds, are actually statisticians. Isn't that incredible? Hearing just 2 minutes of speech, they can pick out the different sounds that go at the beginnings of words and ends of words and start to carve the speech stream, which must sound like a flow of melodies at the beginning. And they carve it into things like phrases and into things like words. In an astounding study, I should go back and just say that if that's what they're doing, they need to hear enough to be able to do the carving at the joints. In an astounding study, in Anne Fernald's lab, I just think this is some of the most beautiful data that's come out in recent years. She used a paradigm that we had developed many years ago, where it's very simple. I call it a multiple guess test for little kids. What you do is you put the baby on one side, and you put the dog on the other, and in your best motherese, you go, "Where's the dog? Can you find the dog?" And even kids who don't speak yet will look at one picture or the other. Now, what Anne did that's even more clever is that she started to time how long it took the baby to look at the right answer, so she can get a measure of reaction time, and she can get a measure of whether the kid looks at the right or the wrong answer. And it turns out that as you get older, you're quicker at making a choice, and you're more likely to be right. All right? So the next slide shows you something quite interesting, and I'll see if I can actually use this pointer. All right, pointer. Do I have it? All right. So she looks at kids who at 18 months of age had had more language or less language from their parents. All right, everyone got it? And then you can look here and ask what they look like 6 months later at 24 months. And what you see is that these are the kids. See how long it takes them to make a response? All right? These are the kids who heard less at 18 months. And these are the kids, look how that jumps up. That slope is so much higher. Who heard more at 18 months. They were ready and raring to go. She suggests that the amount of input therefore affects processing efficiency. It's actually building, as it were, a better system. Let's go to language. That children learn words for things and events that interest them. Lois Bloom, many years ago, said, if you're talking about something relevant, then the kid is going to know what you're talking about. All right, I'll take it. She called it the principle of relevance. Scientists have very fancy names for things. All right. We've done further work on that. Babies attach labels to things that are interesting rather than something's boring. And there's a very important phenomenon called joint attention that a number of people in our field have looked at, back to that kind of relationship. If you tend to notice what your child is looking at, think of it from a teacher point of view. If you tend to notice what the kid is looking at in the classroom, and that's what you choose to comment on, the child's more likely to learn those words. Principle 3. This is the biggie. I'm going to expand just a little bit on this. Interactive and responsive environments build language learning. All right? This is talking with, not talking at. This is expanding on what the child says and does. This is noticing what the kid is finding interesting and commenting on it. This is using a label that goes with what the kid's looking at, even if it's something you don't care about, like a slug. Okay? All right. Hart and Risley showed us data that is consistent here. In another part of their study, they showed us in the yellow bars, you see the professional parents. In the blue, you see the parents who are the welfare parents. Notice how much more encouragement there is. That encouragement matters. It keeps the conversation going. It's not a shutdown. Look at the blue bars, and you see discouragements are higher. Shut up! Don't look at that. In the families that don't know to keep that conversation going. Example 2 is a very recent study that we did where we looked at creating that relationship, that attachment relationship, that sensitivity that Deb was talking about earlier. And it turns out that that may itself have to be created, and that teachers may have to work hard to help create that relationship, that foundation for even looking at one another and having that conversation. See, you knew right away. All right, so in this particular study, we went back to a study that I was on with Deb Phillips, which is the NICHD study of early child care. And we chose 60 low-income children when they were 3 years of age. And we split them up so that we had 20 kids who were going to have very high Raynell scores or language scores when they were 3. By the way, when I say high, I mean for the entire population. We had 20 kids who were going to have middling level scores and 20 kids who were going to have struggling language scores. Then what we did, because this was a longitudinal study, is we were able to go backwards in time. And when we went backwards in time, we had films of parents interacting with these children a full year before. And we could then ask what that interaction looked like. We looked at quality in 3 different ways. For us, quality was, 1, are you looking at the same thing, are you jointly engaged, that your kid is looking at, and to use words while you're looking at it. The second thing that we did is we asked how fluid and connected was the conversation. You probably know this, but we saw a lot of parents who would sit in a corner and not even engage with these kids at all. Oh, the kid's busy. That's fine. Let him go. And 3, we looked at playful rituals. If we had a book, did they even know what to do with it? Did they even know to pick it up? Did they even know that a page would turn? We also looked at quantity, the number of mother's words per minute that she uttered while she was in this interaction with the child at 2 years of age. Could we use these coding categories at 2 to predict what that child was going to look like at age 3? All the coders in this experiment, we use this fancy term, they were blind to what was going to happen at 3, so they had no idea where the kids were going to end up. And this is what we found. The first thing that we found is that the quality of the interaction predicted 16% of the change, the variability that we were going to see when those kids were 3. That's pretty darn high. The quantity and quality together added another 26. So on the quality, we were able to account with quantity 26% of what they were going to look like a year later. How about quantity alone, just amount alone, added only another, uniquely, 1%. Now, this is important for several reasons. 1, it stresses quality, but it also suggests, and I want to remind you, that in this sample, it's not about poverty. All the kids were poor here. All the kids were low income. What we're looking at is presumably a malleable feature, something that is changeable. It's not just about the high and the low. Within low, there's this variability. And I'd like to suggest that instead of thinking about filling a gap in language, which is the way we talk about it, that maybe we're better off talking about building a foundation for language that will help in those quality measures. Evidence 3 comes from the NICHD data set and work that I did with Peg Birchinall. I just want to point out very quickly that if you take high sensitive, all right, across age 6, 15, 24, 36, and 54, highly sensitive parents as opposed to less sensitive parents, and highly sensitive caregivers over time as opposed to less, you can predict on the sensitivity measure how well these kids are going to do in academic outcomes. Were they sitting down, having those conversations? Did they look at what the kid thought was interesting? So what is it about this? What's making the difference? Well, we did a study with video chat. We know that television doesn't do it. You can't just take your kid, plop him in front of a television and expect him or her to learn language. And we know that live is great because that's the quality of the conversation that we've been talking about. What about video chats? All right, before I show you the data, how many of you think that video chat is going to be exactly like live? How many of you think it's going to be exactly like television? How many of you don't want to vote? Okay. All right. The answer is that it turns out to look indistinguishably like live. Isn't that amazing? So now let's ask why. Because in video chats, when the grandmother is talking to the grandkid, and by the way, in countries like Uruguay, they are already using video chat technology in classrooms with language experts to go into the classrooms once a week and work with the teachers and the class. Isn't that interesting? Because they didn't have enough language specialists, so this way they used really certified people and went into the classrooms. Why? Because it's contingent on what the person on the other side says. It's a real social relationship, and the timing's right, and the content is right. Just to make sure, we just checked it out with a very recent study that we did in cell phone use. I don't know if you feel this way, but I'm astonished often by how often parents will drop the hand of a child to look at the text message that just came in. So we did a study on it. And what we did is we had two words, same two words that we used in the video chat study, and we taught them either having one of the words disrupted, or one of the words was disrupted, so after 30 seconds the mom got a cell phone call that she had to answer, and then she could go back to teaching the word. Or in the second word, we just let it go. She had 60 minutes to teach the word and got the cell phone call at the end. All right? You can see what the data look like here. When the mom is interrupted, or when the kid is interrupted, really, the kid doesn't learn the word. When the kid isn't interrupted, the kid learns the word. Okay, so again, that kind of contingency and the timing and on content makes a difference. Principle 4, children learn best when it's meaningful. In a number of studies that we've done in the area of playful learning, we find that young children actually learn more when they're having fun with their parents and their parents are using the rich vocabulary that often happens in play. One example I'll give you is with blocks. When we had parents play with blocks, they used terms with their children like above, under, put the red one on the side. Oh yeah, can you put the blue one on top? Those spatial terms actually relate not only to later spatial learning, but they also relate to later mathematical learning. In fact, that work later was done by Shannon Pruden, who finds that puzzles and block use relates to later STEM learning, and that relates not only to spatial, but to number skills. Furthermore, Susan Levine has done, when you're playing with these blocks, when you're playing games, and Bob Sigler's done some of this as well, you count. You have clumps of stuff. And when you do, you're using number words. And when you're using number words, and when you have to advance 5 spaces, it actually teaches you important things about early mathematics. Principle 5. KATHRYN will say more about this, so I'm just going to skim over it quickly to say KATHRYN's done unbelievable work, as have others, that the diversity of the language that you hear makes a difference in how you're going to succeed in school later on and the language skills you're going to have. And principle 6, I've already touched on, which is that vocabulary and grammatical development are reciprocal processes. They develop together. In fact, in a beautiful study that came out several years ago by Conboy and Thal, they found that the number of Spanish words was correlated with the Spanish grammar skills, and the number of English was correlated with the number of English skills. All right, 6 principles, 1 page, checklist. I think these are the principles that you can derive from the area of language development and check against the opportunities that we're giving our children in our classrooms. And these hold whether you're learning 1 language or whether you're learning 2 languages. Am I okay on time? I'm 5? I can, well, try 7? All right, we're good. Let me just go a little bit to implications and outreach. And here I want to turn to Jackie And Deb, you had a wonderful piece that came out, I think before you were there, in Foundation for Child Development, but I just loved this particular piece on how do families matter. And it talked about 3 mothers and an eggplant, and it's one of my absolute all-time favorite stories. You can imagine this, you're in a supermarket, and you have mother one who goes through the supermarket, and the kid points out this weird purple thing, and, they're going along, and what happens, baby goes, "What's that? What's that?" And mom one says, "You won't like it." Okay, and moves on. All right, now you have number 2, you have the mom looks with, "What's that?" And she says, "Oh, that's a vegetable. It's called an eggplant." All right, and they move on. Then there's us. All right, think about it. "Oh, that's an eggplant. Isn't it interesting? It's a kind of vegetable. Eggplants are really good. You cannot imagine what we can make with eggplants." All right, and you go on and on, you weigh the eggplant. You may even take it home. All right, point is that if you use these 6 principles as a guide, you can actually begin to see the difference in what's happening with mother 1 and with mother 3. And I think the question before us is whether we can train the teachers in our charge and parents to be more like a mother 3, maybe not totally like us, but going on the on the curve, than like mother 1. Can we indeed change these trajectories systematically? And I'd like to suggest that we can. In the California preschool framework that we wrote in these principles and suggested that whatever your culture is, stick with your culture, stick with stories that work for you, but make sure you're checking off the principles as you go. And we offered examples that would work for various cultures just to see how those examples would work. We did, as it were, the manual. In our own lab, we're also doing a play experiment right now in play and reading with David Dickinson from Vanderbilt University, where we read a book, and then we have 3 conditions, either a free play with figurines that go with what you read in the book, or we have a directed play, we tell you exactly what to do, or we have a guided play condition, where we sort of guide the story along and support the kids as they're developing their own story that goes with the book. And in fact, we're finding that the play situation, when it's guided, really does make a difference. That the kids who had adult-supported play really learned more words than the kids who didn't. And there's a very important lesson in this study and in others that we have done. The guided play trumps the free play. The guided play trumps the free play. If you don't have a learning goal in mind, just throwing kids into the wilderness, well, it's great and it's fun, and I'm very for play. But if you have an educational objective, it needs to have a goal that you're working toward that's sought out, because how else will they know what to look for? In the world out there, we also want to expose them through play and through exploration to a lot of words so that as they read, these things have meaning for them. We need to think about how we can build this foundation into our classrooms, as I said, for words and grammars and what it would mean to have a language-rich classroom. One of my other takeaways is that we have to go beyond the school. It's not just about what we can do in school, because kids only spend 20% of their waking time in our schools. So even if we have the very best schools, we have to do more. And I want to just give you one quick example of what we did in a study recently in North Philadelphia, which is a very low-income environment. This entire study cost us $60. It was with an honor student who knew how to draw, so she drew this funky-looking piece of broccoli. And you came into the store, and it said, talking to your child helps their language grow. We realized that a lot of our parents can't come to us. They're not coming to our clinics. And Stephanie and Nani asked us to take a look at other models that have been really important. And I think some of those models are coming from the healthy food environment, right, which I think has transformed what's happening in school cafeterias and also in offerings, even in, what we thought of as awful fast food places now have some healthy options, right? So they find that you need to go where the people are. And the same thing is true of the movement and exercise initiatives. They're going where the people are. I'm seeing exercise equipment in parks, okay? If you can't come to me at the gym, then fine, I'll grab you in your home environment. So we went to a supermarket. In the supermarket, we put up these signs. Question for your child, what's your favorite vegetable? Or we would go to the produce section and say, I'm a delicious apple. Can you find another apple? Now, this shouldn't work, right? It's too simple. It's a little honors project. But we had the signs up condition, we had the signs down condition, and my students pretended that they worked at the supermarket wearing white coats in the background. And all they did is they looked for people who looked like they were 5 or under, and they did checks, okay? Oh, said, was talking to kid talked, mom talked, kid talked, and here's what we found. What we found is that when the signs were down, this is what you get in the number of transactions, and when the signs were up, the parents start talking to their kids. Over on the right, this is what happened in a middle-income environment. So you can see what we did is basically bring the low-income environment up to what's happening naturally in the middle-income environment. We had a 33% increase in the amount of talk to kids. Stunning. All right, finally we're going to need to be able to measure it because I really do believe that it's not enough to just talk about it. You got to be able to measure it. So I did want to let you know that through an IES grant right now, a group of us have banded together to do a 15-minute computerized, evidence-based, self-scoring screener for grammar and for words. We're really quite excited about it. The first data have just come in, so stay tuned. But it's looking pretty good. What happens, we have this in Spanish and in English, so we can test bilinguals and monolinguals on this. But we're looking both at the products of language and the processes of language, how you learn, not just what you learn. And I think that's really important because sometimes low-income kids, we reasoned, may not have the experience, so they might not have heard a word like hinge, but they might have perfectly good capabilities for learning just like anyone else. So here you see one of the examples, and this FEP is blue. Show me the blue FEP. And you have to sort of reason that the FEP, I hope you got the right answer, is this thing. It's the unusual thing that's also blue. And then we would ask the question, show me another FEP, so that we could secure that you could actually transfer what you learned. So that is coming your way very shortly. In sum, if we want to build a strong foundation for language, I think our field knows a lot. And I think in other fields we can do this as well. Abstract away from all of the controversies that we have on the minutia and ask, do we know enough to help kids? I believe we do in the cognitive area know enough to help kids in a lot of ways. The 6 principles was our way of suggesting how we could go about it for language. We can reduce the 30 million word gap. We can help children be ready to read by age 5. And I think we can indeed increase high quality preschool environments so that they're truly high quality in language as well. Takeaways? I think we should distill our sciences into what I call edible science, and I think we should do it across the board in cognition and science. I think we have to jump the school walls to include our community partners in our messaging and in our outreach, and you guys are already doing that, so I'm preaching to the choir. And I think we have to learn from other models that are out there, like the initiatives in eating and exercise. Need to thank a lot of people, so I'm just going to do that hyper briefly and introduce you to Roberta Galenkoff, who I've been working with for 35 years, and of course the parents and kids who make all my research possible, as well as the government support that we've been fortunate enough to have. And to tell you that when I see anything that comes across my desk, my son has recently put me on Twitter. It scared the heck out of me because one morning he said to me, Mom, either you're going to put stuff up here or I am. You have a choice. So now when cool things just come across the desk that I think will be helpful to people, Roberta and I are posting them at Kathy and Row 1. So thank you for your time and attention.
And much of what I'm going to say, I think, will I hope, be reinforcing of those ideas. I anticipated that it would be somewhat redundant, you'll see. But let me start, before I get more directly into the content that Kathy presented us. This conference is called Science and Policy, right? And I think we should just pause for a moment and think, what is the role of science? Obviously, Kathy has given us a lot of examples of how science informs us about key processes in development. There's also kind of evaluation science that gives us opportunities to figure out how to implement, whether implementing those principles works or under what conditions it works best. And then there's what I guess, hope you all are going to go do, leveraging this knowledge, not just edibility, but actually messaging, that making the arguments much more effectively than we have previously been able to do that. And that's obviously, we're well along the way there in this field, but it is a mistake, I think, to make the arguments too simple, right? Because when simple versions of the arguments don't work, they come back to bite you, right? We bought that thing about the 30 million word gap, and now it's 10 years later, and hey, there's still an achievement gap. What are we going to do about that? So I think we really have to think about getting the argument right from the beginning. And I think, actually, I'm going to contest the use of the 30 million word gap as one of those easy messages, because I think it's actually a mistake. I don't think there's not a 30 million word gap. I think it's the wrong message. Science has focused us on vocabulary. You all know this picture. Kathy had a much prettier version of it. It reflects this very, very familiar phenomenon that there are big social class differences in children's word stores, that they start early, they persist across time, and that puts a lot of pressures on all those of us who are interested in quality in early childhood settings to prevent and or remediate that gap. But I think it's a huge mistake to think about it as a 30 million word gap. The 30 million word gap is really a huge knowledge gap. It's not that kids don't know those words. I mean, they don't. It's all of the knowledge that is embedded in the words that the kids don't know. It's the content. And the content is both the domain of difference that we're worried about, because those are topics that kids are going to have to talk about and read about in 5th grade. Right? So getting all kids to read at 3rd grade level by the end of 3rd grade is not going to solve the achievement gap. We can get kids to read at 3rd grade level who are not going to be able to understand history or science or math in 6th grade or 8th grade because they don't know anything. You got to know a lot of stuff. And the easy way to acquire a lot of knowledge for children younger than 3rd grade is to be talked to and with about those topics. So social class differences in domains of knowledge are indexed by vocabulary, but vocabulary is just the thermometer here. It is not the central problem. And obviously, what does this imply? That we have to, as Kathy strongly suggested, we have to talk to kids about things that matter with a focus on building knowledge stores. Quality means words embedded in webs of conceptual knowledge. Right? So give them the toys to play with so they can do guided play with, what was the book? The Dragon and the Knight? Yeah. But then let's have 6 more books about dragons and knights that get recycled through the early childhood program over the course of the next 3 months. Because we have to keep expanding the knowledge and deepening the knowledge. And the only way to do that is content, curricular content, for kids as young as 2. And I would argue that middle-class families have curricular content for their 2-year-olds, and we need to think about how to replicate that in early childhood settings. So what content? Well, one way to think about content is to work back from 4th grade. Right? What do kids in 4th grade get taught about or read books about? about nutrition, about community, about transportation, about cities, about music. You know, this is the list of topics that any decent fourth grade curriculum might touch upon, that you might expect to be able to have a conversation about with an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old you happen to be seated next to on an airplane. And that's one approach, to work back from there. The other approach is to work forward from what kids are most interested in. Right? Kids, it's not that we have to impose on children topics that we find interesting. Kids are curious about an incredible number of things. Now, they're not all equally curious about all of those things, and that's a little bit of an organizational challenge, but they are really curious about slugs, about worms, about dinosaurs, about superheroes, about germs, about music, about art, about all kinds of things. And so another approach is to work forward from what 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds want to talk to you about. And as it turns out, all of those topics map directly onto adult disciplines. E.O. Wilson, the world's greatest expert on ants, described in his childhood in his backyard in Georgia, crawling around and finding bugs and taking them into his mother and having conversations about them. He knew at the age of 18 months that he was going to be an entomologist. And he got to be an entomologist because people could support those interests. And as a result, we know lots more about ants than we would have had his mother not supported that interest. So the privileged children acquire vast quantities of knowledge about all of these domains from being read to, being talked to, by attending pre-K classrooms with curriculum in them, by having dinner table conversations with adults. And we've got to figure out how to do that for less privileged children. Interventions, we know, in pre-K classrooms tend to not influence program quality on the dimension of instructional quality nearly as powerfully as they do the dimensions of warmth and organization of time. Those are easy to affect because they are often interventions that focus on professional development rather without curriculum, unlinked to curriculum. And Jason will talk about a counterexample. But even when we do introduce curriculum, I just have to say I've been looking at lots of pre-K curricula and kindergarten curricula. God, they're boring. They are about the topics that kids all get a chance to talk about. All kids learn the 15,000 most common words of English, right? It's the next 150,000 we need to worry about. And those are not in curricula where the themes are my family, my classroom, my body, my feelings. They're just not. We need to think about those curricula as opportunities for introducing new and challenging topics. Linked to what we know, the challenges we know kids will face. So indicators of instructional quality: teacher language, intensity of instructional activities, integration of language with content, presence of a curriculum, and of course, all of the social emotional supports that other people have talked about. But a huge contribution to social emotional climate in a classroom is having interesting things to do. Bored kids are misbehaving kids. So the big challenge then is teacher capacity to do this. And the workforce that we have is not going to be able to rise to this challenge without much, much better help from the rest of us. I'm going to skip this because I know we're getting up to that coffee break that's going to end, or getting up to Chuck's talk. But, all right, you've seen the data. Thinking about what well-designed curricula are and thinking about designing them not as a list of topics that kids have to learn, but as supports for teachers. Supports and opportunities for extension of teachers' effectiveness in providing rich language. The one other thing I want to say before I stop is that this is really much more important for literacy. Literacy in general is much more important. Math is not unimportant. I think it's important that kids learn to count. But the fact of the matter is that literacy is the product of a lifetime of accumulated knowledge. You can teach kids math. You can teach kids who haven't learned to count to 20 math starting in 2nd grade. You cannot make up for deficits in language and knowledge because every bit that gets added is relevant in the long run. So, and these are the data that prove that. I want you to have a chance to hear from Jason. So the guiding principles here are that children learn on their own and from others, that adult role is not just enriching children's play, but enriching other adults' capacity to support children's play by providing good curricular supports. Thank you. Okay.
All right, so can you all hear me? No. Oh, yeah, that'll do. Is it on? It's on. Okay, hi. Okay, I'm Jason SACHS, apparently right next to the president, apparently. So I apologize for that embarrassing moment. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my process. Literally, I was sitting over there and I realized all the discussants had PowerPoints as a response. And so I quickly made up a PowerPoint, not knowing at all what people were going to say or do. And what I'm going to talk about is how I changed what I put up there. And also, I failed the FEP test, just so you know. And there's 2 typos. So my talk is actually 2 typos and a FEP test failure. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do was to say we need to raise our expectations, right? We have to up our game. We have to really think differently about what we're doing in early education and care. And so that's sort of the theme, okay? And so now I have to bounce between these 2 things, between what I put up here and what I changed. So the first thing is who the teachers are. Right, we need teachers not with bachelor's degrees. We're going to need teachers with master's degrees. We're going to need teachers who understand the complexity of the dance and know how to structure curriculum and really be responsive to what children's choices are. And so I think we really have to think differently about what we're doing with our teaching force. And I know that's going to have massive implications for the field, for diversity, and all of those things. But we have to do this to get this right. So that's sort of one of them. They also have to be paid like public school teachers, so let's just not even go there. We just need to pay them. And so let's see, I didn't change anything on that one, right? Oh, yes, I did. Schools. I want to make a couple comments about schools. So one of the things we heard about second languages, and in this country we only teach 1 language. I think we should just flip it immediately, and everybody has to speak 2 languages, and then everybody has an advantage, and we're not looking at children as a deficit model, but actually they have 1 leg up. And just to give you an example, in the Boston Public Schools, if you look at our Department of World Languages, it's 1 person. If you look at our English language department, it's got a whole office, and we're being sued by millions of dollars. And so I think the idea here is that we just need to change the whole paradigm of language and just go in a different place. All right, so next I put up, we need to up our expectations about the supports teachers receive. In the Boston Public Schools, there's actually common planning time. There's time where teachers get to plan and actually reflect and think about what children do. They have coaches who come in there and model for them. So I think we have to really think about nap time as no time to plan curriculum, that there needs to be real thinking about what we're doing in the classroom. I think higher education has to revamp the way it trains teachers. I think that okay, so HGSE will be starting a program soon, no doubt, in early childhood. They actually ought to have a center for early childhood here. So I think that's another, where's the dean? Where's Dean, right? Okay, all right, so the other thing I put up here is what teachers teach and assess. So there's been a ton of talk about curriculum here and building background knowledge and math. Okay, so I think that's really critical. It's not just FEP and vocabulary, and literally teachers do teach nonsense words because they're so concerned about beginning and ending sounds, and so I think this whole boy example was a perfect example of how nonsense kids are getting exposed to. Okay. let's see. Now apparently we can do it in video, which is kind of a new thing that we've learned. So I still think grandma works on video because there's social emotional connection to grandma, and so you respond to her. I'm not buying that research yet, but I'm game to learn more about videos. Okay. The curriculum needs to be thematic and integrated. I really appreciate the point of multiple reads of books in several contexts. I think that's really important. I just think that saturating it in the context, letting them choose the areas that they go to with guided play are things my staff are smiling because we debate about these things all the time. It's not that I'm against play. I just think talking about play in the public schools is a dangerous thing. And so we've constantly fighting about these things, about how do you message what play means. And I understand for some people it's like a country, and it's like the most important thing to say play. But for me, it's more important that kids are actually doing something they're interested in and they have the space to learn. And so we just have to not draw lines on that anymore. We just got to figure out how to message it differently. All right, how teachers are supervised, I think that's another thing. I think principals don't know a ton about early childhood education. I don't think directors know a ton about early childhood education. So I think how we set up structures within schools and what principals and directors are doing, they need a lot of help. I think often we're now finding that teachers have more education than the director, and so there's a problem there. Because an educational leader is really critical, so I think we have to think more about that. All right, and then what do schools do? Okay, so I think, there's this real fear about public schools, and I think for all of you who are afraid of the public schools, I would tell you that there is a rich opportunity to work within public schools, to leverage a lot of their resources. There's, basically they get all the kids anyways, and so it's a place where all the kindergarten kids are at. KATHRYN mentioned we have written a kindergarten curriculum that is developmentally appropriate. It's fascinating. What I forgot to mention about curriculum is that not only are we teaching interesting subject matter, we're actually telling children they're important. And so you get a lot less behavior when somebody actually says, I care what you have to say. And I want to hear what you have to say. And not only that, the whole group is going to learn as a community. So when the kids go to center-based activities, they actually come back and share what they've learned, and then kids go back and build off of it. So we're building knowledge as a collective community, and that is a huge component of what a good classroom should look like. I know Marina's smiling, she taught me. Okay, all right, let's see. What was the last thing? Finally, I think the other thing that we've done pretty well, and I think everybody needs to do, is use data in ways that are really effective. And I think we really have to think the difference between assessments and evaluation. I think you need to evaluate teachers. We do a lot of focus on instructional quality. We take a random selection of teachers. We have outside people come and do evaluations. And then we use that information both to inform our professional development and practice. But then we also do assess child outcomes. But again, that's on a random sample. But how teachers look at student work is a whole nother area that I think needs to really be thought of. So I think that's another important piece. Teachers really don't know what to do with student work. Either they build portfolios and don't know what to do with it. And so we need to build the time for teachers to observe and reflect and really do some work in that area. I think that's enough. Goodbye. Now how do I get off?
Questions as we then transition to Chuck Nelson's talk. Questions for the language knowledge crew? Play, talk, content, structure. Question here? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you all for focusing on play. I just wanted to start there. And I guess my question started out as a question for Kathy, but I've heard it echoed in the others. And that when you talked about your principles, which were very concise and brilliant about oral language and play and learning, the fourth one said, children learn best in meaningful contexts. And then you talked about play a lot. And I wondered if you would consider a revision and put play in that title. Because I know, Jason, you debated it a little bit just now, but you believe in play too. I know that. And I feel like if there's one thing that really we should be putting up in front right now in this moment, it is that we know a lot about how children learn, and that's play is central. So I don't know if you consider throwing that language in.
play and learning as well. And play is a wonderful metaphor because play includes everything we know about how children learn. It's active, it's engaging rather than distracting, it's on something meaningful that they care about, that you can usually fashion so you can make it a rich world where there's lots of vocabulary. And often, though not always, it's socially interactive as well. Now, play, as you know, has gotten a bad rap. It's, you're right, it's a 4-letter word these days, and I wish it weren't. But I also think we have to be a little bit careful about it, and I think you're right. How we're going to message this is a really, really tough problem. I don't know that the results would be any different if you had a kid who was super involved and engaged, let's say, in slug research or in environmentalism or liked cuisine. I think anything that kids are fascinated by that will have them go to learning joyfully and that will allow them to get that web of learning that KATHRYN's talking about will do the trick. So I don't, when I usually talk about it now, I talk about play as a kind of metaphor for learning. The other thing to be a little worried about, and in 30 minutes you can't say much, is that you have to be worried about the free play versus guided play distinction. And we used to have many, many schools where, you'd go into the classroom and it was whatever you want to do. And I think the research is really telling us that while the whatever you want to do is so important for social reasons for kids, what it might not be as good for is helping you reach a learning goal.
Can I offer an alternative version of that principle?
Yeah.
Bored kids don't learn.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that is.
And I think one of the problems with play is that, kids get very serious about some of these topics, right? So at what point does engagement is the key element here? Whether it looks like play or looks like work. If you're really engaged in it, then it's a context for learning.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for wonderful presentations. I have 2 housekeeping announcements. We will certainly make all slides available online next week, no question. So for those of you who feel like you're writing furiously, you can hold on that. The second is, if some of you are feeling like it's a little tight in here, a little cramped, they're upstairs on the 2nd floor. There's a room, Elliott Lyman, where we are live streaming this. So if folks at some point want to get a little more space, you're welcome to move upstairs to the 2nd floor, Elliott Lyman. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Charles Nelson of the Medical School at Harvard and the Graduate School of Education. We've been pleased for about a year to also call him one of ours as he straddles the world of pediatrics and child education. Thank you, Chuck, for joining us.
Thanks, Nani. So a few things before we start. First, in my day job, I study autism. The slides are down here, so if you notice I'm not making eye contact, it's simply because all my slides are down here. Second, when Noni and Stephanie first asked me to speak at this meeting, I was terrified. I thought, what do I know about pre-K? What do I know about education? But then I thought, what I do know about is what happens in the first 1,000 days of life that helps build a brain that sets up the child to be successful and not successful in school. So the focus on my remarks in the beginning will be on how you build a brain, and then I'm going to talk about mostly really bad things. I'm going to dwell on the negative, the things that happen to children in those first 1,000 days that can influence what you then see when kids get to school. Okay, so now I'm changing these slides, but not my slides. Here we go. Can you turn this monitor off? The one in front of me? No. Okay. I'm hoping we're editing this film for this. So here's an outline. Okay, so nothing, I'm successfully looking at the other talk. I'll try this one. Does this remind you of when you're home and you have a remote control in your hand? All right. Nope, not working. I know. And now it's doing it with. Okay. All right, so this is one. All right, so I'm going to go off script. I'm going to talk about general principles of brain development. I'm going to talk about the effects of early experience on brain development. I'm going to talk about critical periods in brain development. And then I'm going to talk about what happens to the developing brain when the expectable environment, a term I'll define in a few minutes, is altered or missing. So don't worry, this is not going to make you anxious going through the biology. So first, brain development begins a few weeks after conception, not birth, but a few weeks after conception, and continues through mid to late adolescence or adulthood. I think when I was growing up, adulthood was defined as 18. Nowadays, we think that the brain is fully assembled by around the mid-20s. We know that genes supply the basic blueprint for brain development, but once this blueprint is in place, experience exerts a very powerful role in fine-tuning the neural architecture of the brain. Now, we know that some experiences are, or should be, universal to all members of the species. So this would be sensory input, having access to pattern light, hearing things, caregiving. And these basically help ensure survival. There's this other category of experiences that may optimize development. So now we have sensitive and consistent caregiving. We have exposure to complex but age-appropriate language. We have age-appropriate cognitive stimulation. These things may not ensure survival, but they may ensure a quality of life that would be better if you didn't have these things. In many cases, these experiences have to occur during a narrow window of time, what sometimes is referred to as a critical period, sometimes as a sensitive period. And if they don't happen during this period of time, then development can go awry. Keep in mind that experience cuts both ways, so that if a child is exposed to adverse experiences during a critical period of development, then brain development can be undermined. And these effects can persist across the entire lifespan, and that's a point I'm going to press throughout my talk. So one way to illustrate this is to talk about the ability to, how the ability to change the brain changes across time. So this is showing you, I suppose if I point down here, that doesn't really work. Normal brain plasticity is, it took a while, didn't it, though? Normal brain plasticity is influenced by experience. So as you get older, the ability to change the brain declines. And the reason for this is that as you get older, the physiological effort to change the brain increases. So the sheer energetic requirements of the brain to alter it get to the point where it's very tough to alter it. And an example would be the new computer I just bought for my 88-year-old mother, who's sitting out here. Now, I welcome learning a new operating system on a computer, but apparently at 88, having not grown up computers, it's not so easy. So I get 10 calls a day, thinking I was being the good son by buying this new computer, but the reality is that there's nothing intuitive about this, and the effort involved in her learning Windows 7 is not so easy. The point here then is that this is not to say we don't retain plasticity throughout the lifespan, but we retain it in some domains better than others, and in some domains the requirements to change the brain are such that it's going to be very, very difficult. And the example would be if you've never played the piano your whole life and you decide to learn at 60, it'll be more difficult than if you learned at 3. So many elements of postnatal brain development adhere to the principle of critical periods. Most critical periods occur during a time of rapid brain development, the first years of life. After a critical period is passed, the effort involved in altering brain development becomes greater. The big question in neuroscience right now is whether we can reverse critical period plasticity. And so this is just an illustration of what we hope to do. Imagine the ability to rescue a critical period later in life so that you can then acquire new information that would have been much easier to acquire when you were younger. Now, we already do this in rehabilitation. Your recovery from stroke would be an example of that. I'm not going to say any more about this. I just wanted you to keep your eye on this because I think this is a very exciting field of neuroscience right now, which is how to do this. And a good example would be Children who are born with crossed, and their eyes are crossed, that needs to be corrected in the first couple of years of life. Otherwise, there'll be a permanent visual impairment. There are now some models of how to treat that in the adult, both pharmacologically and behaviorally. Of course, the adult rat is what we're talking about. But the point is that I think there's some optimism that we'll be able to do this. Okay, so now part two. What happens to the developing brain when there's a violation of the expectable environment? I'm going to focus on two things. One is toxic stress, a term that really evolved out of the National Scientific Council on the developing child, and then profound neglect. And you'll see why in a minute, but the storyline here is that many of the children entering school come from a history of adversity. So what do we know about this? Here we have adverse experiences on the left side. It can include maltreatment, parental depression, poverty, addiction, extreme neglect. And we know the sequelae of these things can increase psychiatric risks like depression, anxiety, dissociation, suicide, alcohol, drug abuse, antisocial behavior, and the like. We know that there's cognitive outcomes from these kids, cognitive and language academic achievement, ADHD executive functions, and there are physical. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, allergies, and asthma. So the point is that there's an abundance of literature, which I'll review in just a moment, that essentially sets the stage for saying exposure to adversity of varying sorts in the early years of life can alter the course of brain development and behavioral development. And it may do so not just through childhood, but may have lifelong consequences. And the field of biological embedding or developmental programming is now teaching us that what happens early may not just have an impact on early development, but it may reach 50, 60, 70 years downstream. So what are the kinds of stressful experiences that we are concerned about? We have positive stress, so these are personal challenges that have a satisfying outcome. It leads to a sense of mastery and control, healthy brain architecture, good self-esteem, judgment, and impulse control. And I think we're all familiar with this. We have a challenge, we rise to that challenge, we are successful, we feel good about things. Then there's tolerable stress. So these can be adverse life experiences, but that are buffered by supportive relationships. And this is sort of what Deborah and Jack really pushed in Neurons to Neighborhood and subsequent to that as well. And the issue here is that a child is confronted with what we would all consider to be an adverse experience, but when it's in the context of a supportive relationship, then the result is almost the same as if it had been a positive stressor. Healthy brain architecture, good self-esteem, and the like. I think what we're all concerned about is toxic stress. Now, this is a term that, again, came out of this National Scientific Council, and I was an early naysayer. I did not like the term toxic stress because I didn't really know what it meant, and it sounds as though these are categorical dimensions. I have toxic, but you have tolerable. You know, stress exists on a continuum. But the reality is I think most of us recognize what we mean by toxic stress in terms of a lay definition. What makes them toxic in particular, though, are unbuffered adverse events of great duration and magnitude. Unbuffered meaning when an adverse event occurs, there is not a buffering relationship to help the child make sense of or deal with that event. The result tends to be poor coping, compromised recovery, and it can result in lifelong physical and mental disorders, compromised brain development, dysregulated physiological systems. And in the rest of my talk, I'm really going to be focusing on toxic stress. So what are some of the developmental issues for children that we face? We have kids growing up in low incomes, and we've all heard this from all of the speakers today so far. Poor language skills, executive function skills are compromised, and other effects on learning ability. This is, again, a burgeoning area of research right now, and what I find sad is that we've known for many, many years in developmental psychology that growing up in poverty isn't good for kids. But now that we realize it's not good for their brain, we're starting to pay attention to it. What people thought led to the poor behavioral outcome, if it wasn't the brain, is another issue. But the point is, we know that kids growing up in poverty are suffering in any number of different ways. Chaos in the home. So these chaotic family environments, which are getting more and more attention, tends to lead to greater helplessness and distress, poor self-regulatory behavior, obesity, elevated blood pressure, cardiovascular reactivity, And these have sort of lasting effects on body fat accumulation, inflammation, and poor dental health. So the point is that growing up in a chaotic home leads to both a host of behavioral and psychological and physical sequelae. Abuse and neglect, impaired lifelong physical and mental health, shorter lifespan. The Institute of Medicine issued a report about 9 months ago on the state of the art of what we know about maltreatment, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And I encourage you to look at this if you want to understand the variety of forms of maltreatment exerts on the course of development. And then we have these risky families, these cold and unsupportive families. We know less about them, but many of the consequences seem fairly similar to the categories I've listed above. So timing is everything. We know that different neural and behavioral systems are affected differently by different types of adversity at different developmental time points. So what happens, an adverse event that occurs at 6 months could be interpreted quite differently than if it occurs at 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. Not getting your grant funded at the age of 6 months is not such a big deal, but not getting your grant funded at an older age is a much bigger deal. As a rule, early adversity has more profound and longer lasting consequences than later adversity. And what I want to now do is draw from a study referred to as the Adverse Childhood Study, or the ACE study, which is a retrospective study of mostly middle-aged individuals in Southern California, and it carries with it all the methodological shortcomings that a retrospective study does, and yet there's enough replications to know that many of these findings are probably true. So let's just start with the impact adversity in the first 3 years of life has on whether a child will have a developmental delay or not. So this is simply the number of risk factors, all right? And as you move along here and you see that a child has now 7 risk factors, nearly 100% of children who have 7 risk factors in the first 3 years of life will have a developmental delay of one sort or another. What are some of the categories of adverse childhood experiences? So we have abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Neglect. We have emotional neglect, physical neglect. We have household dysfunction, mother treated violently. I do some work in Brazil where family violence is a big issue, but it turns out it's bidirectional. Fathers are beaten up as often as mothers are beaten up. And so when I say mother treated violently, that's a cultural thing. In some parts of the world, it's bidirectional. Household substance use, household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, household member in jail. I was an expert witness in a capital murder case in Georgia about 1.5 years ago. Young guy had murdered his girlfriend who was pregnant, which he thought with somebody else's child, but it turned out to be his. He had every single one of these. When he was 5, his father put a gun to his mother's head and looked at him and said, who do you love more, me or your mother? Choose carefully. And his life went down. I mean, after that, it just escalated. 1 year later, he saw his sister murdered. So the point is that this sort of scenario is not uncommon among people who, as adults, have all sorts of problems, which I'll describe in just a minute. So what are some of the effects? So this is the risk of substance use, either alcoholism or illicit drug use, based on the number of adverse life events that occur in the first years of life. And you can see these things just track one another. So as you move up to an ACE score is simply the number of adverse events that you endorse, you can see that the risk of having a problem with drugs or alcohol increases almost exponentially. What about adult heart disease? Same thing. So these are odds ratios, meaning the chances of developing are 1 time greater, 2 times greater, and the like. And as you move up to 7 or 8, you can see that the risk of developing cardiovascular disease, for example, is more than 3 times greater among individuals who have an ACE score of 7 or 8. So, exposure to toxic stress during sensitive periods of development, generally the first few years of life, can have a profound impact on child and adult brain development, behavioral development, and biological development. The greater the number of adverse experiences exposed to, the greater the risk for compromised development. So it isn't the simplistic model of having one adverse event. It's really the accumulation of adverse events. So now I'm going to turn my attention in another direction, which is the effect of profound neglect on brain development. Why is neglect bad for the brain? The brain expects input that it doesn't get, and if it doesn't get that input, it doesn't know how to wire itself. This is particularly egregious if the experiences that are expected to occur during a sensitive period fail to occur. Pattern, light, sound, caregiving. So a child who is born with dense cataracts and doesn't have access to pattern light, unless the cataracts are removed early, the child has a permanent visual impairment. The same would go in the auditory domain. But conversely, we can also imagine a case where the lack of caregiving is absent in the environment, and that can lead to alterations in brain development. So the question here is, what happens to the brain when it's deprived of most expected experiences during a sensitive period of development? And the reason I'm bringing this up is the way neuroscientists typically approach the topic of how does experience impact the brain is they do animal models and they selectively rear an animal or they deprive an animal of different kinds of experiences. But we don't have that option in the human. We have to depend on so-called accidents of nature, children born with cataracts, children born with a hearing impairment, and the like, and the reverse, kids who have no such impairments but are brought up in truly neglectful households. Why is this important? So, the most common form of child maltreatment is neglect. If you look at this figure, you can see that in 80% of cases of reported child maltreatment, 80% of them involve neglect of one sort or another. There's isolated forms of medical neglect, Munchausen's by proxy, which is those of you from Boston who've been following the horrendous case of the girl who was treated at Children's for over a year has some, I probably shouldn't go on, but you know what I was going to say but didn't. The point is that neglect is more endemic than we think. And we're not talking about not giving your child French lessons. We're talking about children where the basic needs are not being met. Much like we do in animal studies, we try to infer how experience or the lack of experience impacts the brain by looking at things that might occur in nature, because ethically, of course, we can't systematically deprive someone of certain experiences. And a model system for this is to study kids who grow up in institutions. And the reason for this is that institutional neglect, and you should know that there are still many kids who grow up in institutions, live in institutions in the United States, although we often call them residential care facilities. I think there's 144 in Washington, D.C. alone. The point is that studying profound neglect is a window into what happens when the brain doesn't get certain experiences at different points in time. So I don't mean to persuade you that the study of institutions on its own is interesting or important as much as it's a model system for understanding the role of experience or the lack of experience. So I'm going to draw from a project that two colleagues and I have been doing in Romania for the last 15 years. And the goal is to impress upon you what happens to children who lack certain experiences and then what the lessons are for those of us who work in the United States. So in this project, this was essentially a randomized controlled trial of foster care as an intervention for early institutionalization. The way it began was that we screened more than 180 kids who were babies at the time to determine which ones looked healthy. So kids who had obvious chromosome or genetic or neurological problems or fetal alcohol syndrome were screened out, and we then wound up with 136 kids who looked like they were typically developing. We assessed them extensively when they were between the ages of 6 and 30 months or so. And then after the baseline assessment, half of the kids were randomly assigned to a foster care intervention that we built, and half were randomly assigned to remain in the institution. Now, I should quickly add the reason we could do this was there was no foster care in Bucharest when we started the study. We had to create our own because there was none. There was none in part because there was a strong sense that the only people who would take a child into their home not related to them biologically would be a pedophile or had something horrible in mind for the kid. So after extensive advertising and screening, we only could identify 58 families who could be good foster care families. And we put 68 kids in those 58 families because we kept siblings together. And then we had a group of kids who lived with their biological families in the city who had never been in an institution. We saw these kids at the baseline, again, then at 9 months later, 18, 30 months, 42 months, 54 months, 8 years, 12 years. I was there 2 weeks ago. We're now rolling out a 16-year follow-up. Those of you who do longitudinal studies, I think this is a genetic polymorphism that either we inherit or it occurs spontaneously, and it's like an addiction doing longitudinal studies. And I swore that after 54 months I was done with this, and then I said the same thing at 8 and the same thing at 12, and here I am. So what I want to do is just highlight a few bits of data from this study. I'll start with cognitive development. In the beginning, we studied cognitive development using a simple developmental screener called the Bailey exam, which I suspect will be familiar to many of you. This is the Mental Developmental Index. And you can see at baseline, the average IQ, which is its proxy for, is 64 for the kids in the institution, and it's 103 for the kids who've never been in an institution. So you can see right off the bat that the effects of being in an institution, even for just a year or so, are tremendous. They drop your IQ well into the range that historically we would have called mentally retarded. What about the effects of the intervention? This is just as the intervention effect. You can see at 30 months, 42 months, 54 months, the blue line represents the kids in foster care, and the yellow line represents the kids who remained in institutional care. Now I want to digress for just a moment and say another ethical requirement was that we have a policy of non-interference. So we expected kids to change their group assignments as the study progressed, mostly because the government was going to go in and say Johnny should go back to their biological family, or Susie is going to go to government foster care, which started later in the study. We had no say about that. All the data I'm presenting are based on what we call an intent to treat design, based on your original group assignment, not where you wound up. And as you'll see in a little bit, at the age of 12 years, only 14 kids still live in an institution. So when I report these effects, it's based on where you were assigned, but not where you're currently living, which makes it a very conservative test of early experience. The most important thing that came out of the cognitive data is the timing effect. If you look here, these are only the foster care children. The kids placed at the youngest ages had the best outcomes. And in fact, if you look at kids placed after 24 months, their IQs are virtually indistinguishable from the kids who never left the institution. So, institutionalization has a very detrimental effect. Foster care appears to be effective in improving cognitive outcome, particularly for kids placed before 2. Duration of time in foster care did not influence the outcome. It was carried by timing. In other words, it wasn't how long the kid was in foster care, it was how old they were when they went to foster care. I should add, we see the same thing in language, except the critical period is much earlier. It's closer to 15 months. I did that for KATHRYN and Kathy's sake. It's also to illustrate the point that it's not that there's a critical period. Critical periods vary by domain. All right, what about brain? So what we did at every age is we did EEGs on these children. And what you're looking at is, I have to do this spatially, a view from the top looking down on the head. We record brain activity from the surface of the scalp with just little sensors we put on the head, and we assign different amounts of brain activity, different colors. So red represents much more brain activity than green does. And what you can see here, and just the orange, I almost did that. Nose, back of the head, left ear, right ear. Over the frontal lobe, you see dramatically more brain activity in the never institutionalized kids compared to the institutionalized kids. So then part 2 then is the effects of institutions on EEG is quite profound. The brain, think of this as a 40-watt light bulb versus a 100-watt light bulb. Well, I guess with the new light bulbs, it has to be a 12-watt light bulb versus a 15-watt light bulb. What about the follow-up? At 8 years, here's what happens. These are the kids. CAUG stands for Care as Usual group, the kids in the institutional group. And these are the kids placed in foster care after 2. And those curves are identical. These are the kids placed in foster care before 2, and these are the kids who've never been in an institution, and they're identical. So like we saw with language, with IQ, and now EEG, we see a sensitive period around the age of 2 years. For those of you who work in early intervention, what's most impressive is how long these effects persist. So this is the 12-year data, which we got about 2 weeks ago. That's why the drama of introducing the slide. You can take an EEG and decompose it into different frequencies. You've all heard of alpha waves and beta waves and theta waves and things like that. In the case of theta, less theta is good. In the case of alpha, more alpha is good. And what you can see, let's just start, what you can just start with alpha here, you can see that both the never institutionalized group and the foster care group have indistinguishable levels of alpha activity. Both have more than the care as usual group. And in terms of theta, both the foster care kids and the never institutionalized kids have less theta than the kids in the institutional group. And at age 12, remember, only 14 kids were still in an institution. The rest were now all in families of one sort or another. The fact is, the effects are being carried by what happened early. So once we observed these effects, which are summarized here, I got increasingly concerned about what was going on in the brain with this experiences of profound neglect. So we started to perform magnetic resonance imaging on the kids when they were 8 to 10. And here's what an MRI scan looks like, and here's a brain, which I hope you all recognize as a brain. And here's what we find. And Deborah set this up. She used the term gray matter. Gray matter, okay, so just to fill you in, a neuron is just one type of cell in the brain. It's got a body, and it has appendages called dendrites and axons, and I'll come back to that. Gray matter simply refers to the cell body itself, or sometimes the dendrites. What we see is a dramatic reduction in gray matter in the ever institutionalized group. In other words, there's no intervention effect here at all. The kids who've ever spent time in an institution, regardless of whether they're still there or they're in foster care, show a dramatic reduction in gray matter. Whether this is an actual reduction in the number of neurons, we don't know, but it's suggestive of that. If you look at white matter, now we see a hint of an intervention effect. We see that the kids in foster care have more white matter than the kids in the institutional group, but less than the never institutionalized group. And that's sort of a trend in our study overall, which is that the kids in foster care, as a rule, although not in all domains, but as a rule, do better than the kids in the institutional group, but rarely do they catch up completely. But keep in mind that the average age of placement into foster care is at around 20 or so months. What we don't know is what would have happened if we had placed them at 6 months or 4 months. And in a study going on in the UK by Michael Rutter, he in fact has shown that kids adopted out of Romanian institutions into the UK under 6 months of age look indistinguishable from their adoptive siblings. So, having demonstrated that we see a reduction in gray matter and in white matter, but a little bump in white matter, what we then specifically were interested in is the wiring of the brain. When I was thinking of the talks we've heard earlier on language, there's this very elaborate network in the brain that wires up the different language regions, back of the head to the front of the head and the like. And we can now look at these fiber tracks using magnetic resonance imaging. So this is probably more information than any of you ever want, but the point is that we can infer the integrity of these fibers by the dispersion of water molecules. And the less dispersion, the more tightly compacted myelin is on those fiber tracks. And it's these myelinated axons that transmit electrical impulses across the brain. So for language, we need to wire up the back of the head and the front of the head for language to be a sort of a complete system. So what we're looking at then are the integrity of the fiber tracks. Think of this as the telephone wire. So KATHRYN and I can each have a telephone. I guess, though, with cell phones, we don't really need wires. But let's make believe when KATHRYN and I were growing up, we needed wires that connected the two phones. Doesn't matter if we have the phones. We don't have the wires. We don't have communication, right? So that's what we're looking at with diffusion tensor imaging. In the areas of the brain involved in memory and emotion, basically the limbic region, which is shown in these slides here, all right? what we see is a dramatic intervention effect, that the kids placed in foster care have the same degree of integrity of these white matter fibers as the kids who've never been in the institution, much more than the kids who remained in care in the care as usual. So there's a big intervention effect in these two areas that are involved in memory and emotion. And similarly, if you look at areas involved in executive function, we also see an intervention effect. So the way you interpret this is that here, okay, yeah, right. So if it says FA, more is better. If it says MD or AD, less is better. So you can see in the top that the care as usual group in the upper left has higher what's called axial diffusivity, which is bad. If you look in the lower left, you'll see that the care as usual has lower fractional anisotropy, which is bad. The point then is that in the areas of the brain dealing with memory and emotion and in executive functions, we see a big foster care effect, that the integrity of these fibers is greater than the kids who were assigned to the care as usual group. So exposure to institutionalization early in life leads to a reduction in general brain activity, in a reduction in gray and white matter, a reduction in connectivity, that in terms of the intervention, EEG is remediated in most frequency bands. We see no intervention effect for gray matter, partial intervention effect for white matter, and we see a partial intervention effect for specific fiber tracts. So what we are desperate to understand is what has actually gone on at an anatomical and physiological level in the brain. We see less electrical activity, we see less myelin, fewer neurons probably, and the question is, will that persist? Now the last thing I'm going to mention, which was also mentioned in Deborah's talk, is the newest thing that we've been looking at, which is stress responsivity. How do children who've grown up in these profoundly neglectful environments cope with a stressful situation? So we use a well-established test of stress called the Trier stress test. All the speakers are going to experience this today. 5-minute speech preparation. That's what the 5 minutes before we get up here, we're still writing our talks, all right? 5-minute evaluated speech, right? We're giving the talk, and the kid is given negative or neutral feedback during their talk. And then we have a 5-minute arithmetic task where they have to count backwards by sevens with feedback. Now, it's not awful feedback like, you're stupid, but it's, a form of disapproval, we'll say. What we then do is we measure their cardiac response, and we can also measure their cortisol response, what's referred to as their hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Most of you would recognize that in this context, you're going to show what's called sympathetic arousal. Your heart rate's going to go up, your palms will get a little sweaty, and you'll have a cortisol response to this stressful situation. So what we wanted to know is what happens to our kids in this situation. So this is a cardiac response. It's a measure of sympathetic nervous system activity. And these are the different segments going, the speech prep, the speech itself, and the math. In every instance, you see that the never institutionalized group has a much bigger sympathetic nervous system response than the other groups, but the foster care group does show the intervention. It shows more of a sympathetic response in the kids in the institutional group, but less than the kids in the never institutional group. So part one then is that the kids growing up in families show the expected cardiac response, a sympathetic arousal. There's some of that in the kids in foster care and very little of that. It's blunted, in other words, in the kids in the institutional group. What about cortisol? So we measure cortisol continuously across the different phases of the study. And what you start to see when you get to the Trier stress test is the kids in the never institutional group show a big court response, right? So they start leaking cortisol, which is exactly what you'd expect. But notice that in both of the other groups, the foster care kids and the kids in the institutional group, they show a blunted response. They're not reacting to the stressor. But what's interesting is if you take the foster care kids and divide them into those placed before 24 months and after 24 months, the kids placed before 24 months look identical to the never institutional group. They do show the appropriate court response. How am I doing on time? I'm not done yet. Okay, so there appears to be sympathetic and hypothalamic pituitary. The reason the monitor's here is that I don't have to make eye contact with them. Sympathetic and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysregulation among the kids in the care as usual group. The foster care kids show at least partial remediation in both of these systems. What's important about this is imagine a child who's entering school when they're constantly confronted with stressors, academic stressors, social stressors, how they respond to that. And an example of this, which I took out, is we look at peer relationships in our kids. If you take, we create dyads. So we take a kid in the study and they're paired with a kid in the community. If you look at how two kids who've never been in an institution interact when they're 8 or 10 years of age, you give them toys, they just play with the toys and they interact with one another. But if you put in that room a kid who's been in the institution for a long time or was assigned to that group, they don't know how to interact. Not only don't they know how to interact, but the kid who's making overtures from the community stops making overtures after a while because they seem to be picking up these signals that there's something going on with that other kid. When you look at these kids, they don't know how to respond to a stressful social situation. So, it's well established that early profound neglect leads to alterations in brain development, but many questions remain. Nevertheless, kids can thrive in spite of adversity, especially if supported by nurturing caregivers who can mediate their levels of stress and build their resilience. Even among the kids in the institutional group, when we evaluate the quality of caregiving, the kids who received better caregiving had better outcomes, even though they were still in the institutional group. So, what are the recommendations for folks in this room? A sizable percentage of kids entering preschool have experienced early and in some cases prolonged adversity. Educators, I think, need to be mindful of the child's developmental history. Now, I recognize that in a classroom of 30 or 40, this may not be so easy, but I think some of this may help explain the behavior of some of the kids you see. Over and above school-based interventions, all interventions designed for early childhood should engage caregivers to maximize effectiveness. When you look at the washout and things like Head Start and other programs, it's one thing to spend 6 or 7 hours a day in school, but the rest of the time is at home. So to mediate the impact of potentially negative behaviors of caregivers like neglect and abuse, any isolated intervention within the walls of an educational setting will have minimal impact if the home environment is violent or stressful, for example. You also want to harness and magnify the positive impacts of caregiver support and attachment on a child's developmental milestones. Caregivers may be well-meaning, but unaware of the role they have to protect and enhance their child's potential. And then, lastly, early detection and early intervention are key. This follows the earlier is better rule. You can't intervene early if you can't identify who requires the intervention. So intervention should be designed and implemented to prioritize early detection through systematic training of intervention staff and other things. So early intervention is key. This is the principle of pay now or pay more later. And what I think I'm going to do now is end with a video that the council created that sort of summarizes everything I've said in 3 minutes. So if you could start this.
What if you could take action to reduce crime, improve health and education levels, increase family incomes and state revenues, and improve the quality of life in communities throughout your state? Where would you begin? Science tells us that we may find the solutions to these complex social problems in early childhood, when the architecture of the brain begins to form. Brain architecture is built over time and shaped by experiences, starting in the earliest years of life. The most important experiences come from the environment of relationships that interact with each child. Parents, extended family, and caregivers of all kinds. But serious adversity early in life can disrupt healthy brain development. Both brain architecture and behavior are increasingly difficult to change as individuals get older. So what happens early matters for a lifetime. Now imagine you can take action to improve the lives of children and the quality of life in this community. Where and when would that action be most effective? The links between policy, parenting, and brain architecture become much more clear when we can see how formative events and family and community environments affect child development. For example, policymakers want to make their communities safer, or improve children's learning, or reduce the cost of chronic health problems. A child raised in this environment may experience lower levels of stress and more opportunities for learning. That leads to sturdy brain architecture and a healthy stress response system, which prepare the child to achieve higher levels of literacy and other skills early in life, and later leads to improved school achievement and decreased dropout levels. Positive early experiences can also reduce levels of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Increased health and education levels can have positive effects across society, like reduced crime and increased income and tax revenues. Policies affect both individuals and communities, so making wise choices that support early brain development can improve health, behavior, and learning throughout life.
So the last point I want to make, which will take 30 seconds, is that even though the data for neuroscience and many aspects of psychology supports the idea of critical periods, I don't want to leave you with the idea that it's all over by the age of 2 or 3. This was a notion that was circulated in the late 1990s, which drove many of us nuts. What we're arguing is that in these early years, we're building a foundation. And if the foundation is weakened by the exposure to, say, adversity, then that means the risk of subsequent development can be compromised, but it doesn't mean it is or will be compromised. It simply elevates the risk for that occurring. But the other point is that it's better to build a brain right the first time than to have to rewire it later. And so the take-home message then is that it's not as though if you do for the parents in the room, if you do everything right those first 3 years, then you can just sort of lay back and, everything will be fine after that. It doesn't work like that. You need to maintain that. But the effort involved in correcting things increases exponentially. So if you're going to treat a kid with antisocial traits or conduct disorder, do it in preschool. Don't wait till they're a teenager would be one example of that. So on that note, I'm going to end. Oh, thank you. Stay up here. Question? Yeah. Questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Are they supposed to use the microphone? Yes. You need to use the microphone because I think they're recording this. You're lucky it's right there.
Have you done any studies on with the young children and apparent death?
I haven't, but I can answer the question. First of all, there's how old the child is. A parent dies with a 2-month-old, that's different than if it's a 10-year-old. Second, going back to the buffering relationships, often the extent to which there's a support system in place helps a child negotiate the hazards of having a parent die. Deborah, do you want to? Yeah. So I don't think that it's not like there's an extensive scientific literature looking at parent death. Divorce is, of course, much more likely to be studied. But I think that what we do know is that if there's a supportive relationship in there for the child to go to, interacting with the age at which the death occurs, that will determine, in part, the outcome.
Hi. Oh, this loud. First, I'd like to say thank you for further deepening my commitment to be a foster parent.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
And secondly, though, as an early childhood educator, you do have access to families, and you're one of the first sort of ports of call for helping families to better the outcomes for their children. And so when you have those increasing levels of risk factors, are there particular ones that are more damaging than others? Because, you know, it's great to say, yes, we should get from 7 factors to 0, but, you know, oftentimes the reality of working with families is that you can only do one thing at a time. And so I'm just wondering if any of the research has shown, you know, where are the best places to really focus your attention?
Deborah's looking at me thinking, good luck with that one. But, and I'm looking at her hoping, so we can probably develop a hierarchy of these, right? I mean, death would, the maltreatment is up there. But what the literature shows is it really the accumulation and number of, rather than the severity of. And it also has to be contextualized with whether there's a supportive relationship and how old the child is. But I know what you're getting at, and I know how important this is. So let me give you an example, and this is sort of off script. I'm about to launch this huge project in Bangladesh. And kids growing up in the slums of Bangladesh are faced with a level of adversity that's unprecedented. It isn't just 30% of the moms have depression, or, I mean, it's also chronic diarrhea and all kinds of illnesses. And one of the things that a medical student and I are going to work on is a way to quantify this. So if we could list 100 bad things that are happening to the kids, how would we figure out what is the most important? Because that would be the target for intervention. Reading between the lines as a foster care parent, one of the things you need to know is, like, what's at the top of the list of the issues the kid is coming into your home with? Because you may be all kinds of things that you have to deal with, but you have to sort of start somewhere. And that's sort of also what lies underneath your question. And it's hard to, I don't know if the science is there quite yet. Was that?
Thank you. So I would just say a couple things. I don't think we do know, but if anyone here does, you know, that this one is worse than that one on these kind of couple points that things I'm thinking about these days, don't have answers. One is, I think we have to also look at the kind of cascading of the risk. It's not just counting up the amounts, but it is this issue of turbulence and chaos in kids' lives, right? So constant changing of household membership, not just being a single mother or not. So, you know, it kind of is bringing an even more dynamic lens to the cumulative risk literature. The second point I would make that I think a lot about, but I don't know how much we know, is kind of the combo of kind of biologically based risk and environmentally based risk as being potentially extremely damaging.
So there's two. Don't go. Well, you don't have to go away. There's two ways to view biological. There would be a biological hazard, like being born very prematurely, right? But then the other part, and the elephant in the room, is genetics. So some of you may have read Jay Belsky's editorial in the New York Times a few weeks ago, arguing that one's genetic background influences how one embraces the environment, for example. I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that editorial. So on the genetic side, it's pretty weak science, but it's an interesting concept. But we don't like to talk about that because there's nothing, what are we going to do about that? Does that answer your question?
Kind of.
We did our best.
Yeah.
Can she take another shot
what
at it?
I'm getting from that, just real quick, correct me if I'm wrong, is because it seems to be cumulative, that the idea would be to tackle what's easiest first, to get it out of the way.
No, I don't think we're
No.
saying that.
I don't think we know that.
Okay.
We don't know what's easy.
You know, developmentally, what we mean by cumulative, it's not additive. Okay, so it's not like one adversity and then a second, then a third. they snowball and it becomes exponential after a bit. So how to deconstruct that is a different matter. What we also don't understand, and I suspect it's on the mind of some in the audience, is this issue of resilience. We all know kids who face unbelievable adversity and yet seem to have overcome that, and we don't really understand that. We can describe it, but we don't understand it mechanistically.
Okay, thank you.
Chuck, we're going to stop.
Okay.
I think to stay on time. Oh, thanks. You know what? Maybe we can just do an offline question. We just have exactly 1 hour for lunch. Do you want to just shout out the question and we'll see if it's a long one or
Make it a
short
yes or
one?
no question.
It's a quick one. So one of the things that keeps resonating for me when we talk about the convergence of the science and then improving early childhood education, I keep thinking of the power and the potential of classroom discourse and the way language is used in our classrooms, not just amongst children, but the way teachers use language. That language has such potential not just to convey to children content knowledge, but knowledge about, to convey to children the belief in them as as agents of their own learning and actively engaged. So when I think about building resiliency for children, a teacher who says to you, I believe that you can do this. This might be difficult, but I know you're the type of person that can be friends with each other, that can work out this problem. I think if I were creating a syllabus for early childhood education, I would say having teachers think about how they create that discourse out loud and internally for children is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really quite brilliant. I think the theme then is really what the child is hearing is, you care about me, you're making an investment in me, you believe in me. And that's the idea of this buffering relationship that we talked about. So it's not just what's in the family, it's what goes on in the school. Last summer, I gave a talk to 50 science teachers from around the Massachusetts, and I remember thinking the number of teachers that somehow noticed me and made a huge impact. So, okay, we're done now, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you so much.